Good afternoon, everyone. I will just, with your permission, let's wait just 2 more minutes. The room is not an obvious place to find. So we wish, first of all, thank you all very much for being so creative to find the room, but let's give a couple more minutes to colleagues to find it. Thank you. All right, I think we are ready now to begin. First of all, again, thank you all very much and good afternoon. My name is Dick Baird. I'm with the Wiley Ryan Law Firm in Washington, D.C., where I'm the Senior International Policy Advisor. A couple of points first before we get started. I would like, first of all, to acknowledge some people who have made this panel possible. First of all, I'd like to recognize Jessica Jones of British Telecom. Jessica, if you could raise your hand, please, who has nicely volunteered to be the substantive rapporteur, and thank you, Jessica. In addition to Wiley Ryan as sponsors of the panel, I'd like to acknowledge Learn Asia with my colleague Rohan, who I'll introduce shortly, and as well as the government of Colombia and Minister Molano, who will also be speaking in addition to Wiley Ryan, are co-sponsors of this panel. And lastly, I'd like to thank Barbara Warner. If Barbara could raise her hand, who without her efforts, the panel would not have been possible. Thank you, Barbara. The title of this panel is The New Global Visions for Internet Governance, ICTs and Trade. It was the thought of the panelists in discussions in forming this panel that the digital economy, which is based on the Internet, as we all know, allows for large or small businesses to have a global reach, to virtualize their processes, to mobilize their employees and business associates, and to drive velocity into their efforts. And this panel is to consider the codependent relationship of globalization and the Internet, and as the combination of those two factors as drivers of future models of governance, economics, and trade. We will look at this complex issue as it is now evolving as we speak, and will continue to evolve over some period of time into the future from at least 4 different perspectives. First of all, from the perspective of innovation, that we recognize that globalization based on the Internet, with its focus on dispersed production and value chains and consequent interdependence between countries, has created potential for new visions for innovation with significant implications for trade and investment. Secondly, the second perspective is the potential for economic growth and development. Thirdly, the governance policies' impact on globalization. We cannot separate the manner in which the Internet is governed or follows governance models, plural, from globalization itself. And fourthly, the role of the private sector stakeholders in globalization as that role continues to evolve. So from these 4 perspectives, this distinguished group of panelists will address this complex issue. We wish to say at the beginning that we hope that the panel will interact with you all, and so we would expect that you would raise questions and make comments, and we wish, of course, we encourage you to do that. Let me first introduce the panelists, and then we will go right into their presentations. Each panelist will have about 7 to 10 minutes of presentation time, and then we will open it up for a discussion. First of all, to my right is Ross Lajeunesse, who is the Global Head of Free Expression and International Relations at Google. To his right is Dr. Rohan Samarajiva, who is Chair, Learn Asia, Colombo, Sri Lanka. I would wish to acknowledge next, the second position to the end is the Minister Diego Molano, who is Minister of ICTs Ministry in Colombia. Mr. Sam Paltridge, who is, as everyone knows, is a true expert in so many areas, and we're lucky to have him as a resource at the OECD, and he's a senior analyst at the OECD. Dr. John Selby of Macquarie University in Sydney, and then we have Subi Chaturvedi, who is at the University of Delhi at the Sri Ram College for Women in New Delhi. And lastly, who will be speaking in the wrap-up position is Mr. Eric Loeb, who's Vice President at AT&T Corporation. So in the order in which I have introduced the speakers, I would ask them to do their presentations, and we have conveniently mixed their seating arrangements so that it doesn't go just in seriatim. So first, but let me introduce and ask Ross to make his opening remarks, please.
Thanks very much, Dick, and thanks everyone for being here. My presentation is going to be very brief in the spirit of IGF, and considering the number of panelists, I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to share their expertise with all of us. But I did want to say just a couple of things about Google's perspective on the issue of the internet and the role the internet plays in expanding global commerce and especially industry and small business. I mean, there are certain facts that I think we're all very much aware of, that, you know, the internet has allowed smaller enterprises to reach customers in markets that were never before available to them. There are plenty of examples about this from the US and from very developed markets, certainly. But increasingly we see examples of small businesses in places like Africa, where connectivity itself and the infrastructure challenges present are very real. When you look at the continent of Africa, I think we have only 16% internet usage currently, and yet we still have tremendous examples of very small businesses reaching an incredible customer base and an international customer base. And Google is doing a lot of work to advance this. We have this program, we call them the GABOs, which is basically getting businesses online. And what we do is we go to a market and we've thought, how do we take away every impediment to this small business getting online? Everything that would stand in the way of this small store or small entrepreneur getting online, and we help them with it. We do it with them, and we've done these trainings in pretty much every state in the United States, and we've gotten, you know, millions of businesses online in developed markets. But even in Africa, we've been able to get 60,000 new businesses online since we've started doing these programs. And so we now have examples in Nigeria. There's the Zaris Fashion and Style Academy, for example, which, you know, reported an increase of 500% in their business operations and in their enrollment within 6 months of getting their business online. In South Africa, you know, there's a party planners business which has seen the revenue triple in a matter of months by going online. So none of this is news to really any of us here, but I did want to emphasize a few points which may not be quite so readily known to us. For example, 75% of the economic benefit that's now attributed to the internet does not go to internet companies or technology companies, but to what we consider more traditional operations like retail and more traditional services. And I think that's an incredibly high percentage. We've seen globally, the average is that small businesses, including traditional businesses, see an increased revenue of double the previous amount of revenue after they've gone in line. Now, so when we look at these facts, and when we look at the fact that by 2016 the internet is supposed to contribute $4.2 trillion of economic activity in the G20 alone, it becomes very apparent that we need to do everything we can to minimize the friction or take away the barriers for these small enterprises to do their business online. And that is how we start talking about getting the policy and the government, the laws and the government policies correct in order to enable this sort of thing. So that is one of the reasons why at Google we look at data localization initiatives, for example, and we become very concerned. That is why we look at issues like sending party pays proposals, and we become very concerned. Last year, my team actually commissioned a report by the Dahlberg Institute, which found pretty much a one-to-one correlation and is beginning to find evidence of causation between a country's regulatory approach to the internet and how well that country's businesses do online and the effect of those policies on a country's GDP. It was perhaps the most astounding part of that study, to be honest, is that we really hadn't found anyone who had done that work before. So I think that is an area ripe for additional study, and it will only become more relevant as the internet plays an increasingly great role in the world's economy. The other issue I just wanted to raise is the issue of trade. Many internet companies, and Google is certainly in this situation, have really come very late to the issue of trade and to the idea of using trade to advance the right policies to promote internet businesses. And I'm glad to say that we recognize that we need to be much more present and much more engaged in those issues, and we're starting to see real recognition in draft trade agreements and among trade negotiators for the need to ensure that trade rules advance the internet and promote internet businesses globally. And with that, I wanted to wrap things up, and very open and welcome to taking any of your questions after my other panelists have had a chance to speak. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ross. Now, if I may introduce again Dr. Rohan Samarajiva for his comments, please. Rohan?
Thank you. I was quite interested in this. I've been interested in this subject for a long time, partly because when I was in government, I was on one side trying to create a program called Sri Lanka, which was a comprehensive e-development or ICT development program for Sri Lanka. But on the other side, I was also in charge of services trade negotiations for the country. So there were some people who felt that these were contradictory objectives, that the only way that we could develop our ICT industries would be through protectionism. And to some extent, I think they're wrong, but I think to some extent there is some substance to their impressions, the feelings that they have. The issue is that ICTs on one side have an incredible positive potential. And that positive potential is why organizations such as mine, which are basically knowledge-based organizations, can function today, based in countries like Sri Lanka, and compete with anybody, basically. So that means that it has a very positive story, the kind of positive stories that we normally hear at these kinds of discussions. It is what has made business process outsourcing real, because we apply ICTs, we unpack business processes, we unpack supply chains, and now people who are in faraway locations who've got some comparative advantage can participate in these business processes. However, the negative side of it is that, in fact, this is a two-way street. The markets that were earlier shielded from competition by large players are now open to competition by these large players. So let me discuss that in relation to two examples that a lot of people in the developing world, a lot of government people and industry people that I interact with are looking at these days. One is China, where I think some of you may have heard today that the Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba does more business than Amazon and somebody else combined. It's a huge organization. And to a certain extent, Alibaba has been shielded through protectionist policies. They use ICTs, they use the potential of the internet, they are e-commerce pioneers, but they've been shielded from this global competition. And on the other side, we had this extraordinarily challenging e-commerce environment in the second most populous country in the world, India. And in India, as you know, the rules are Byzantine. I'm in Turkey and I'm talking about Byzantine. The payment systems are like made by people with twisted minds. It's extraordinarily difficult, and the trust levels, the whole idea of, very small percentages uses credit cards, but even those who have credit cards are not willing to give them on the internet, and not willing to part with money until they actually see the product, and so on and so forth. Even in this extraordinarily difficult environment, you had two companies, Myntra and Snapdeal, I think, which pioneered and actually did some very significant innovations. For example, they took that old delivery payment on delivery model that we had in the postal system in the old days, and they applied it where these people would ride around in motorbicycles, and then they would give the product, and then they would take the money in cash or even on a credit card at the premises where the goods were changing hands. So now we have a very interesting example where China is still not open to the global giants, but India is. I look at Indian TV all the time, even though I don't live there, and I see the Amazon ads running big. And Amazon is throwing enormous amounts of money at the Indian market. So many people that I talk to are looking at these two models and say, will the Indian businesses survive in this environment? Or is it going to be that we'll all have to retreat to the Chinese model of putting in gardens, walled gardens, etc., building up our companies and then going out to compete? So in the old days, we used to talk about and say bad things, some of us, not me, about the Washington consensus. I think it's time that we start addressing the Beijing consensus. Because this is basically a worldview that is engaging the attention of a lot of people in the developing world. Now, the issue really is, I think on one side, we have to understand that not every country has to do every single service activity or internet-based commerce activity or internet-based business that there is. There is the law of comparative advantage has not been abolished, and we should be open to the Amazons coming into our countries. I am a loyal customer of Amazon. I wouldn't give it up, even if you take off not my arm, but maybe a small finger, I would keep, because I would be deprived of books, and I would be deprived of the ability of my organization to function if people take away such services. So I'm not at all in sympathy with this protectionist argument. But what we need to do is we need to address the problem. Why is it that our governments, this is no international conspiracy, the arcane and complicated and convoluted and sometimes contradictory rules that our businesses are subjected to are imposed by our governments. There is nobody in the world who says that a young person, a small business, or a young man or woman trying to start a business should not be able to receive payments from PayPal. It's my government that is preventing them. It's not a foreign government that is telling the Indian people who are trying to do payments on the internet that they must get off the transaction, get on SMS, receive a one-time PIN code, and then input that PIN code into the payment connection, which has now already got disconnected. And it is the Indian government which hasn't given enough spectrum, so that even in the middle of that transaction, we would have got disconnected anyway, even if we didn't purposely disconnect in order to input the PIN. So it is we who are hampering and hindering and handicapping our own businesses. So I think our governments need to think. Quite a lot of the innovation that has taken place in our part of the world, and I'm very proud of some of these innovations, including the budget telecom network model, has been because of hardship, has been because we have been subjected to such difficult circumstances that in the process of working around, we have come up with new business models. But is this the only way we know how to innovate? Is it not possible for our governments to make it possible for our small businesses to use the potentialities of the internet and the ICTs by creating a conducive as against hostile business environment? I think this is a challenge that the government representatives, as well as the chambers of commerce, as well as all of us, have to address and have to think about as we see the commercial activities based on the internet rising in importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rohan. If I may now ask Minister Diego Molano to address this issue, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Look at the internet economy is, of course, changing every single business on earth, every single business. And we cannot stop that. What we're seeing this week at the IGF is that the regulation power is always a kind of diminishing, you know. So regulating the internet economy is going to be harder and harder, and I fully agree with that. The thing is, how we really take advantage of this internet economy to solve the real problems of the world. How we take advantage of this digital revolution to finally solve, you know, for many, many problems such as poverty, access to education, food supply, etc., etc. But so far, what we are seeing is that in this digital revolution, we are not doing that. And we are going to have deeper gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Why is that? Yesterday morning, we had a quite interesting discussion on jobs. Jobs. The digital economy has great advantages for education, for health coverage, to include people, but we are destroying a lot of jobs in the world. We can't do anything to. I think that's the right way. All the revolutions have created unemployment. The thing is that there is no other revolution in the history of the world that destroyed more jobs proportionally than this revolution. So what we should do? What we should do, because the whole world is going to blame our industry for that. You know, so we have to improve the resilience. So we have to train our people, and that's the main element. How we train people, how we prepare people to resilience in the job market. Because people are going to blame, again, I tell you, blame our industry for that job losses. And in terms of economic trade, developing countries are also losing the battle, big time, like never before. Look at, for example, in the 90s. In the 90s, the trade balance between the developed and developing world in terms of telecom and IT was very, very, very positive in favor of developing countries. Why was that? It was because telephone traffic. So the guys from AT&T used to pay a lot of money to our countries thanks to their accounting rates. So that, of course, with the technology, that doesn't happen anymore. Calls are for free, so that's already, the traffic's already balanced. But what happens today is that, so in those days, it was like the Robin Hood effect. So rich people would give money to the poor people in terms of the whole balance. What happens today is the whole opposite things. We pay a lot of money for internet access to these guys, and also we pay a lot of money for services to the other guys, to the Google guys and the OTTs. So this is like the Hood-Robin effect. Not the Robin Hood, but the Hood-Robin effect. And it has to be like, I mean, they are doing, legal business, and they are, promoting their business and creating value for their shareholders, which is fine. Don't take me wrong. The thing is that today, internet is still a tool for the rich of the world, not for the poor. Why is that? Because internet doesn't have applications for the poor. And that's where the issue is. Of course, we discuss a lot about expanding infrastructure in those poor countries, which we have to do. And we've done already that in Colombia. So the Colombian base of the pyramid is already connected. We've deployed fiber everywhere, even in the middle of the jungle, everybody's connected, but that's not enough. The value of internet is not in the infrastructure side. The value of internet is where the applications are. Without applications, there is no value. And the challenge we have is how we create those applications. And that challenge, the only way to tackle those challenges is to create our own local ecosystems to create those applications. Because the guys from Silicon Valley, they have no clue what a poor person is. They have no clue what the needs of my small companies are. We know what those needs are. And for example, and somebody was saying about examples of small companies. In my country, 4 years ago, just 7% of the small companies were connected to internet. Today, more than 70% of them are connected. Why is that? Because we focus on developing applications for them, creating value in the application layer for them. So the challenge we have is how we create these innovation ecosystems to develop applications for the base of the pyramid. And the key success factors of those ecosystems are very, very simple. The first one is talent. We need more people trained in engineering, IT, technicians. We also need to strengthen our IT skills. And some at the OECD, you work very hard on this. We have to strengthen our IT skills of our people. We need doctors, lawyers, nurses, everybody understanding how technology works. Every single laborer of the future has to be a little bit of an engineer, or IT engineer. We have to work on that. So the first element is talent. The second one is to create local ecosystems, not nationwide ecosystems. We have to focus on regions or cities to create these local ecosystems. And the third key success factor is the leadership of the private sector. I haven't seen even the first ecosystem led by the government. Governments are very, very bad at this. So those ecosystems should be led by the private sector. Those are my initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Our next speaker is Sam Paltridge, please.
I'm on? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I just have one slide that I'd like to show you, and it's from a report we did earlier in the year. And I perhaps just better explain what it is. I hope it's big enough on the screen for you. On the left-hand side, you have minutes of telephony going from the United States to India. That's the blue line. The red line is minutes of traffic going from the United States to Africa. On the other side, you have the average termination charge for terminating those voice minutes to those regions and that country. In both areas, there's been tremendous increase in mobile penetration, and that's fantastic, and that's the result of competition. In Africa, you can have up to 6 mobile operators. In India, it's an extremely competitive market, and that's really fantastic. So why do you have an 8-fold increase in outgoing minutes from the United States to India? And as you can see, for Africa, it's basically, there's a flat line, or if I put a different scale on that, you'd actually see it decrease in recent years. Now, there's lots of different reasons you can look at. You can look at the growing importance of India to the US, the economic exchanges. But there's another reason, and that's the policies around termination of traffic. And I want to talk about that in my 7 minutes, and then say how it affects the internet. So on the right side, you have the average prices for US operators terminating traffic in those regions. And you can see, actually, those prices have been increasing in Africa in recent years, whereas in India, they've been decreasing. Now, I'm picking a bit on Africa, and perhaps I shouldn't be, because there's a much wider trend in other parts of the world, in the Caribbean, or countries like Pakistan, for example, where as you see the prices increase, you see, as you might expect, demand decrease. There's something more at work here. In a lot of these countries, the government's introduced policies which basically recreate cartels for incoming international traffic. And in some cases, they create market shares, so you have the same market share you might have had 10 years ago. And then there's a whole series of policies around that to try and make this work. Basically, as the prices increase, you create the potential for arbitrage in a grey market. So there's a huge grey market that emerges in these countries. Pakistan, for example, 2 years ago, increased the termination price for incoming traffic, and the official data shows that at least the official termination traffic coming in went down from about 2 billion a month to 500 million. Now, this actually leads to a decrease in revenue. So even though governments get sold a story that if we introduce such a policy, we're only really charging those foreigners, and they're rich, and they can pay. What actually happens is the wealthy foreigners, if you want to look at it that way, use broadband, and they bypass all this. Broadband to broadband bypasses this. Skype to Skype bypasses this. What it doesn't bypass is the diaspora in certain countries calling family, friends, or trade, or whatever it is in those countries. So what happens, those calls get terminated back on the fixed network, and then these policies come into play. And it's the diaspora that really are price conscious. So an increase in termination from, say, as it happened in Pakistan, from 2 cents to 8 cents, it really increases the price for people calling their families. And so the traffic falls off. And so it affects the poorest people in the developed countries, if you want to look at it that way. It has all sorts of other implications. It leads to double taxation. So if you're the diaspora in a country like the UK, VAT gets applied to the surcharge. So you're actually paying tax on tax. So there's a lot of stories here at this event about people avoiding tax. Here you've got a case where, due to a certain set of policies, you get a double taxation. It also leads to all sorts of bad practices around internet management. So to try and make these policies work, in some countries they create so-called whitelists. So if you're a business, you get put on the whitelist, then you can have a virtual private network. But if you're not on that whitelist, you're likely to get knocked off. And so when these policies come into effect, quite often businesses don't know about this, NGOs don't know about this, and suddenly their private network gets knocked off the internet. You can imagine what that does to economic stability, to things like investment, growth, etc. There's also other policies. Just recently there's been a case in the Caribbean where Skype was being blocked. And again, it's this idea that if we block this traffic somehow, we'll try and stop this. But it doesn't. It just leads to more grey traffic, and that leads to all sorts of problems around legal intercept and so forth. I'm going to stop there, in part because my tracker just went dark on me. I think I was about 6 minutes when it did, so I'll stop there. And you know, there's much more I could say on this, but it really is a serious problem, and it's going to increase as a serious problem for the internet as networks converge. Because, as the Minister said before, some countries based certain policies around the old accounting rate system and incoming revenue, but those policies aren't appropriate for the converged internet. It won't work. And it really leads to less revenue than more revenue. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sam. Dr. John Selby, please.
Is that working? Can you hear me? So one of the major themes of this year's IGF has been globalisation, localisation and debate on different sides, and we've been hearing quite a lot about it today. I'm going to focus on routing and looking at some of the consequences for international trade. Traditionally, network engineers have made routing decisions with technical protocol development like BGP under the auspices of the IETF. Whilst data hosting location selection and peering arrangements have a business element, lawyers on the whole have generally stayed out of this space. With regards to some aspects of the debate over a globalised or localised internet, this relative absence of lawyers might be about to change. I will illustrate this with a brief case study about how data localisation intersects with international trade in internet services, and then consider its implications for internet governance stakeholders. In February 2014, in response to the Snowden leaks and concerns about the Five Eyes nations' government's ability to intercept online communications, German Chancellor Angela Merkel proposed building a European communications network, which would route into European internet traffic within that continent. The French government also expressed support for this idea. Building upon these privacy concerns, Deutsche Telekom advocated for an EU-wide routing localisation and the revocation of the US-EU Safe Harbour framework, under which data has been exported to the US. So there is the possibility of requirements in Europe for data localisation at a national level, at the regional Schengen level, and at the EU level. And we've seen debate and discussion about other proposals in other countries as well over the course of this meeting. So how might these proposals bring lawyers into the routing business? The first way was seen in April when the Office of the US Trade Representative placed the German government on its Section 1377 watch list on compliance with telecommunications trade agreements, stating that a variety of EU voices were advocating for trade distortive restrictions on data flows, purportedly justified on privacy grounds, and claimed that such steps could amount to providing protectionist advantage to EU-based ICT suppliers. The US Trade Representative claimed that raised questions about the EU's compliance with its trade obligations with respect to internet-enabled services. At this stage, the US has said it plans to closely monitor the development of such proposals. So how could the implementation of localised routing requirements create a trade dispute? In the limited time in this panel, I can't discuss all potentially relevant trade obligations, but I have three that I would like to briefly mention. The one that I'll focus on most is the World Trade Organization's General Agreement on Trade in Services, the GATS, though I'll also mention 2 draft agreements currently being negotiated, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership agreements. First, to the GATS. This is a top-down regulatory system that lacks a multi-stakeholder policy development process. Speaking at a general level, amongst other things, the GATS requires each member state to provide other member states with market access in those sectors to which it has made specific commitments on specified terms. Under its national treatment principle, to treat those foreign competitors on an equal footing with domestic businesses. And thirdly, under its most favoured nation principle, to not give businesses from one GATS member state more advantageous terms for market access to a sector than it gives to any other GATS member state. Member states set out in technical documents called GATS schedules which sectors and on what terms they're willing to open their markets for trade. So some nations have included in their GATS schedules trade in internet services. Within the GATS, there are both general and specific exceptions to these free trade requirements. Regulations are generally preferred if they are the least trade restrictive option. And there are several relevant GATS provisions which I'll paraphrase for you so you don't fall asleep. The most relevant is GATS Article 14C, subsection 2, which permits member states to introduce laws that protect the privacy and confidentiality of individuals' personal data, as long as those laws are the least possible barrier to trade and are not a disguised restriction to trade. So a GATS member state could possibly claim that data localisation laws are explicitly permitted under this Article 14C, subsection 2. Unfortunately, this article has not yet been interpreted under the GATS dispute settlement process, so we don't know with certainty whether any particular localisation proposal will fall within its scope or not. The second relevant provision is GATS Article 14 BIS, which gives broad power for member states to intervene in trade to protect their national security interests. However, this is focused more on essential security in wartime situations, and it's a risky provision for a GATS member state to invoke because of the opportunity for tit-for-tat responses by other member states. This Article 14 BIS is arguably not meant to be an unfettered discretion, and any dispute might need to determine whether the Snowden leaks have resulted in an emergency in international relations. GATS disputes are resolved on a state-against-state basis, not on an individual or corporate basis. So it would be governments who would decide whether or not to bring such an action before a GATS dispute settlement body panel. If a country that has included trade in internet services in its GATS schedules were to implement data localisation requirements, then to avoid breaching their GATS obligations, they'd have to mount a defence in a GATS dispute that such rules that they'd introduced fell within the Article 14C2 privacy exception or the Article 14 BIS essential security exception to their GATS commitments. So it's possible that we may see such a dispute in the next few years on this issue, and a dispute settlement body of an international trade law institution such as the World Trade Organization could be applying an Article 6 necessity test to determine how the internet should be routed. They would be asking whether a particular data localisation law is proportionate response to the surveillance powers of the NSA. If the privacy or essential security exceptions were found not to apply, then there may also be arguments relating to public morals and public order exceptions. So that's the GATS, where we might see lawyers getting involved in determining these issues. I'll move on to a couple of new and upcoming trade agreements. These are the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership agreements. Some of the leaked drafts of these have included terms that member states would endeavour to refrain from imposing or maintaining unnecessary barriers to electronic information flows across borders. A leaked draft of a schedule to the TTIP reveals the EU did not place limitations on market access for computers and related services, including online information and data processing. So these data localisation laws might see disputes under the TTIP. We don't yet know the final version of that, though. So we should be thinking about these proposals as to whether the dispute resolution mechanisms that form part of either the GATS or the TPP or the TTIP are the venues where we want to be resolving disputes about routing and hosting. We may see under the TTIP and the TPP disputes being in entity against state rather than state against state, so that's a difference to the GATS as well. In conclusion, stakeholders engaged with internet governance debates need to recognise that internet governance decisions are not occurring in a vacuum. Existing and future international trade law institutions and commitments made under them may have very different processes for stakeholder engagement than the multi-stakeholder model which we're used to. The dispute resolution processes may constrain policy decisions we can make. Consequently, we can't afford to ignore these other institutions, and it'd be wise for internet governance stakeholders to actively engage with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Our next speaker is Subi Chaturvedi, please.
Thank you, Dick. Good evening, everyone. Before I go for it, I do feel like a little bit of an interloper here. I'm suitably awed and overwhelmed speaking with you and sharing my thoughts on this really important issue. May I request for a show of hands, any first-timers here for whom this is the first IGF? Thank you. A special shout out to you and our young friend in the back. Well, what is it that we're looking at in terms of a new global vision? As the only woman on the panel, I have an additional responsibility also to speak to that very important question. The internet roughly has about 4 billion people online, which has been equal to both men and women and has been gender sensitive in terms of being an enabler. So this is a resource that is really important for us, and that is something that we all value and cherish. So when we speak about a new global vision, what is it that we look at in terms of barriers, and what is it that we see in terms of potential? So I will cheat a little because I have the mic, and being a teacher, the tyranny of the mic has to be unleashed. In terms of questions, let me start with a little story, and I want to go back to a favorite dead white man with whom I've had a slightly troubled relationship, none other than Mr. Aristotle, who talks about locating context in society, who talks about valuing anger, and who talks about looking at a society which is also based on friendship, on understanding and empathy. So when we have big business on the panel, and when we have policymakers and organizations and governments and technical communities, media, academia, and those are the stakeholder groups who we want to see in policy making, so that we have an environment which is enabling. It is important to realize that we need to appreciate differences. Why is it that technology matters? Well, it matters for people, planet, and it matters for profit. We can all profit in monetary terms, or we can profit in terms of the knowledge economy, in terms of transfer of skill sets and capacity building. So many years ago, the Long Island beach could only be accessed if you could have access to public transport. But somebody decided to design over bridges which were low-hanging and passes that would not allow you to have a bus which is roughly about 14 feet high to navigate those roads. You could not get to the beach because there was racial and socio-economic segregation. Many years ago also, the invention of the bicycle gave women empowerment both politically and socially, and also gender politics ensured that there was the invention of the female pill and not the male pill. So when we look at questions of policies that enable businesses to flourish, Rohan here pointed out about the Flipkart, Myntra, and I want to go back to Flipkart and Myntra because this is a unique experiment. When you're looking at small businesses trying to come online and use this medium to deliver new products and invent new products that meet local needs, it is very important that you have policies which are consultative, policies which are not rushed. I want to recognize a colleague who's here in the audience, Ms. Mishi Chaudhary, who's from India. She's done a lot of work on intermediary liabilities. When you're looking at intermediaries which facilitate these conversations to have happen, which initiate trade, commerce. And Nominet, incidentally, is also going to recognize a unique initiative which is called Tech Mums. This is a group of mothers who plan to come online, go back to academia and teaching, and use the internet to sell, connect, collaborate, and create comfort groups and spaces. This is the power of the internet. So when we have to recognize that this is something that grew out of the framework of governments and needs probably less governance and even little governments to ensure that the core values of the internet and ICTs can flourish, whether it is permissionless innovation, whether it is interoperability, whether it is freedom of speech and expression. And each of these are both limitations and potentials. If you have laws which are enacted without due consultations or policies which are ambiguous, you create an environment which is not good for small business. Big business also has access to fantastic legal advice and recourse and input, but small businesses struggle. So when they create applications which will allow you to say, review a product or review an institution, and it allows people to engage with that community and that platform, and they get sued for millions and trillions of dollars and have to stand in court, they cannot run the business, and they need the time to engage with that space. So one of them is policy, which is thoughtful, which is consultative, which looks at the internet. And second, let's bring in some numbers. We love numbers. When you're looking at the India story, we're right now contributing, looking at the internet economy at, let's say, 1.6% of its GDP, which is roughly about $30 billion US. If we're able to provide in the next 2 years some key requisites, we can make sure that this number moves up to about $100 billion US, which is a significant shift in terms of what is it that the internet can contribute to the GDP. But despite credible initiatives like the NOFN, which is the National Optic Fiber Cable Network that will connect 250,000 village panchayats or self-governments, that's not good enough, because you're not giving enough incentive to the private sector to be on the table and use that fiber to provide services and deliver goods. It's just a piece of, let's say, plastic, which is no good. When you look at laws which are ambiguous, then you create an environment which chills and quells free speech. So to the young man in the back, I hope he's still there, I urge people to, right there, I urge people to engage, because when you look at countries like India, we have immense amount of demographic dividend, but if our youth are unemployed and angry at being cornered every single time, then there is impediment to using that space for actualizing its full potential. In terms of the evolution of a multi-stakeholder environment, and that is something that is really close to my heart, where you convene these meetings, and which is why I wanted to know who's here for the first time. How easy or difficult is it to be on the table? As governments, if you're not on the table, you will be on the menu, and you will have a really unhappy country, which in the form of social media will make sure that though corporate media might disallow plurality and diversity of expression, will find ways for an outlet to express dissent. And this is part of the new vision. We have to make sure that traditional institutions of socialization have been overturned. We have to learn to engage with this new reality and this new paradigm. So in terms of whose voices are not here? Who is it who's missing? In terms of legitimacy of representation, who is not on the table? And are those people who are on the table, can they speak for those who are not in the room? So when we're looking at trade and policy, the one company which is giving nightmares to Amazon is Flipkart. And there is a lot of money which is being pushed to make sure that it comes to you. But what Amazon has also managed to do is it's taken service agreements on its head. It's taken conversations and it's invented a new language where communication flourishes and where new goods and products are made accessible. And competition is a good thing, provided you recognize local innovation and make sure that it's an environment based on empathy, maybe like the river. And I want to go back to Joanne, who's with the Diplo Foundation, who talks about many sediments and many layers of this river. So if you're looking at big businesses becoming bigger, you have to make sure that you give a helping hand. And if you're a stakeholder community from, let's say, academia, you have to ensure that you have to continue to engage with this environment despite it being acronym riddled, despite it being a close community. And if you're the youth, this is your internet. You're the key stakeholder group. So if they tell you, no, this is cybersecurity or this is trade negotiation, you don't have to engage, you will still have to come to the table because you're the end users. And for policymakers, it is important to realize that from the citizen, the slave to the citizen, we've made a long journey and we're part of this process. So India, again, is a beautiful story. And the new government which has come in understands the value of the internet. So this potential and this medium can be harnessed by all, provided we look at it not in silos, but as a conversation where all of us speak to each other and with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Subi. Eric Loeb, please.
Not yet? Can people hear? Okay, we'll go with this. We can shift. We'll shift a little bit. Great. Well, thank you. It's fun to do cleanup because you can pick up on lots of interesting ideas that have been raised, Subi, Sam, Diego, and many themes that come together. A lot of this is about the discussion of making sure that you have in place the right tools to achieve the policy goals that you want. And we heard a lot of very interesting ideas about what the different goals appropriate for each market at the situation that that market is in. And I want to start with a point that's perhaps a little bit pedantic, but I think helpful to keep in mind, and that is the interrelationship between market facts, policy, and regulation, and how these are distinct, interrelated, and they need to be dynamic. Because as your market facts change, so must you continue to reevaluate, are your policies the same, have your policies shifted, and then very importantly, are the regulations that you have in place or the lack thereof fit for purpose for what you want to achieve? So it's a pedantic point, but I think it's an important starting distinction to make. First, you set your policies, what it is that you want to achieve. As we heard from the efforts in Colombia, for example, of ensuring that now that there's a lot of competition, the next goal is to extend it out to ensure that folks that currently aren't accessing the technology have demand-side incentives to do so. Policy could cover economic, social, safety regulation, whatever it may be. The regulations that you have in place, of course, or the decision to forbear from regulation has to be constantly reevaluated depending on what is happening in your market. And I simply make this point again because sometimes things get stale. You have something in place, it's the legacy approach, it's what you've done for a long time, and you may find yourself one day realizing that your rule is actually disserving your policy. Great case in point in Colombia of something they resolved 8 years ago or so, the fee to get a voice license was $150 million. Originally probably in place to give someone incentive to be a voice service operator so that they would deploy voice services. Well, the market was changing around, and all of a sudden you find actually that's impeding your goal by impeding competition, and frankly no one could justify paying that much money for a license given all that was going on. So smart choice, remove that rule, change it, open the market up. It's just an example. I bring this up just because we are in an era of just unprecedented change in everything about networks and services. And we can look 6 years back, we can look 6 years forward. We can only guess about 6 years forward, but in 6 years back, even if you look on the mobile side, you'll see places where you've gone from 2G, 3G, 4G, LTE. In that space, you've gone from there being barely a smartphone, no app store, to how we exist. All right, that's 6 years. Obviously, massive changes of the type of services and the type of capacity consumed and traffic growth. Changes in how people compete, what services are there. It's truly astonishing when you think about all of that. And so it's worth wondering once in a while, are the market facts, the regulations, and the policies still the same? Or should we kind of, open the windows and blow the dust around a little bit just to evaluate? Have things changed so you are still accomplishing your goals, or you might be impeding some? It's a healthy process to go through. When I look ahead to the next 6 years, I'm excited about what's up there and kind of wondrous about what it will raise in terms of policy challenges. I work for a company that is an operator of networks and a provider of services, and when you look at the core, you see that we're rapidly moving to a software-defined network, an all-IP software-defined network, where you're going to have a collapse of the stack, of the layer O to layer 3 network stack, and intelligence in the network is not going to be hardware-based but software-based. Services can be rapidly deployed, and you're going to have a diminishing distinction between folks operating networks and folks that just provide services. It's going to raise very interesting issues, particularly about how, from a policy standpoint, you decide you want to encourage the investment of these much more efficient and effective networks, what rules are in place. And on the edge of the network, and this is going back to something Diego was getting at, of what might be the societal benefits and how do you encourage them. One of the areas that gets a lot of discussion this day, and I'd say deservedly, is in the area of machine-to-machine or Internet of Things. Small points, like what it might do in terms for rural agriculture, for more intelligent use of scarce resources like water, so you're not turning the spigot on at the same hour every day, whether or not you need to, but if you maybe have a very inexpensive soil detection meter, feeding information in, so only water when you have to, or only fertilize the amount that you have to. Small things like this. I raise the point because again, when you go back and you look at your policies, your regulations, your market facts, and what you want to achieve, if you go in and look at wireless machine-to-machine and assume, I'm going to treat that like a handset or a tablet because it's a SIM-connected device. If you apply all the same rules to something that has none of the same characteristics, you may end up stifling something before it begins. So that's one point there. One other point I wanted to pick up from what Rohan and Ross had said, and then I'll stop so we go to questions of something evolving and interesting, is this notion of cross-border data flows and its relationship to trade. Somewhat we take for granted in the nature of how businesses around the world operate, services are provided, innovation moving without a sense of boundaries, that it will always be effective. And there are these incipient risks that we see pop up with not driven by a technology reason or even a business reason to say we're going to put an artificial boundary on the movement of information. And there may be some situations, limited situations, where there's a rationale for that. But if it is done in anything other than the most justified, legitimate need, it's going to have really significant consequences on the services that people enjoy, and certainly on the ability of businesses to operate and invest in an effective manner. And that has knock-on economic consequences. So it is an important issue from a trade context and a new one to capture the notion that maximizing that flow of information and the flow of opportunity to use the most innovative services is a benefit. With that, I'll pause. I look forward to questions from the participants.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now let me open it up to questions or comments from the audience or remotely, please. Yes, please.
Louise Bennett, BCS from the UK. You were talking about small businesses online. For high-value transactions, the banks mostly deal with payments, but for small businesses, particularly in developing countries, people may be unbanked who are going to make a payment. Now, you can have the man on the motorbike as the intermediary, or you can use mobile phone technology, as they do in Africa with M-Pesa. Do you think there's a need for a standard, an open standard that will enable small payments between unbanked people and small businesses to enable internet commerce?
Let me ask the minister to address that. If you would, please.
Look at, again, the main bottleneck to expand technology is not in the infrastructure side, it is in the demand side. So the problems with the small companies is not about infrastructure, it is not about the price. They do have the money to pay for a computer or for internet. The bottleneck is in the application side again. Look at what we did in Colombia is we went to big companies. And we told them, look at, you have in your supply chain a lot of small companies, either your providers or your distributors. If you develop applications for them, I sponsor that development up to 50%. So, for example, we went to Cemex, the big cement company, and they have 25,000 little shops that sell cement around the country. These little mom and pop shops that they didn't have internet access. And they developed this application where the store owner can order cement online. And which is fantastic for Cemex. This big company saves a lot of money because now they can manage the inventory online. And we did the same thing with the Nestlés of the world, the Procter & Gamble's, and many of those companies that involve SMEs in their supply chain. What happens to that store owner today? That they can order the cement online. But since Cemex saved a lot of money, they decided to share those savings with those guys. So cement online is between 10 and 20% cheaper than the regular way. That's a lot of value. Most of those store owners were old people. They were afraid of using technology, but the value was so big for them that they found a way to connect to internet. They asked their daughters and sons or nephews or whatever, but they found a way to hook it. What happened next? Cemex said, this is a great business. I have to collect the money from those guys. They used to have a whole network with armored cars and guys collecting cash store by store. They decided to move to online banking, but they gave additional savings to those guys. So now they are all paying online. because they see the value for them. They see the value, money value, day by day value. And the good thing about it is that the taxman is very happy, because those guys who were not in the formal economy now are part of the formal economy. And that links with another set of policies that we have, which is eliminating taxes for technology. We went to the taxman 4 years ago and told him, look at, you should eliminate taxes for technology. Oh no, that's impossible. Look at, I need this revenue. I said, we demonstrated that eliminating taxes for technology is way better off for the taxman. Because thanks to technology, more people move to the formal economy. And we've proven that already. So there is enough supply of banking systems, online banking systems. The problem is in the demand side. So you have to develop policies to encourage the demand to jump into the new electronic means.
Thank you very much. Other questions, comments? Please. Mm-hmm.
So, Patrick Curry from the British Business Federation Authority in UK, and I'm also in International Cyber Alliance. The question that I have is really in two parts. The first thing is that I'm struck by the fact that none of the primary sectors that are in the end use for primary globalized supply chains is represented in this discussion at all, which is where most of the money is. So I'd expect to see banks, energy, health, and so on. And these are the increasingly regulated sectors as well in this space, which ties into privacy and many other things that are being discussed while we're here. The top issue that we're hearing from nations, from governments, is the requirements for trust mechanisms to support the sharing of information. And that's in many, many senses. And we're seeing this as being incredibly important in regulated industry sectors, and the introduction of trusted clouds to support SMEs, to go back to Louise's point. So we're looking for mechanisms which would help to improve the interoperability of trust mechanisms to underpin both sharing of information and payment transactions. And we could talk about LEI and G8 and so on. So I'd be very interested, please, from a panel's point of view, is what we could do within IGF to build trust into all aspects of what IGF seeks for the future.
Who would like to take that question? It's an institutional question. Subi, maybe you'd like to address it, please?
Thank you for that question. So the IGF is a 9-year-old baby, which is looking at going to its 10th next year, and rightly so. The evolving internet ecosystem, I absolutely concur and recognize the fact that digital trust is at the heart of everything internet. If you are not sure that the information that you're sharing or the purpose for which you're coming online is going to be addressed or met, there is absolutely no incentive for you to trust money, your resource, or yourself, which is your entire identity and existence online. How is it that the IGF is ensuring or responding to some of these questions? This year, a lot of innovations have happened, and the IGF was trudging along and going out and doing good things and initiating good conversations. But then Net Mundial happened, and there were issues and specific outcomes and responses which were requested. This year, with ISOC colleagues and members of the MAC, we initiated 5 best practice forums online, which are looking at some of the problems that you have indicated, which go to the heart of spam, which look at certs and how is it that more certs can be established. They look at multi-stakeholderism. Sure.
Let me qualify. This is about business.
Yes, right.
We need more trust to underpin the business evolution and economic advantage. So forgive me, I didn't make that point clear enough.
Right.
Could we have the economic lens on this Please.
Sure. So in terms of the best practice for us, there are 5, and they're looking at exactly these problems that you're indicating from an economic, social perspective, as well as a policy perspective. I would urge you to go online. What we do not have are prescriptive solutions. And for that, there are many similar processes which have initiated. So there is the WEF Net Mundial initiative. I would also invite you to a session that we're doing tomorrow morning at 9:30, which is looking at the IGF way forward and strengthening the IGF. What is it that you would expect from the IGF? Your comments and your inputs would be really valuable there. Thank you.
I was just going to pick up one other element, just to address the question, because you raised an important challenge with all these kind of trade friction points, and your message is critical that this is an insular issue about IT companies. It's about every one of our customers that operate in a lot of places. I mean, that's what the cross-border data flow issue is about at the end of the day. It's their ability to conduct their business. And one of the friction points certainly is how to operate and be in compliance with a patchwork of different privacy obligations, many of which normatively may be important, but not always identical. And one of the more interesting mechanisms that is playing out right now that I think is a good model is the work going on between APEC and the EU Article 29 Working Group to do a mapping of the different privacy regimes that are in place to find the extent of overlap. And so it's an active project aimed at this notion of interoperability to see how much overlap is there, where are some gaps and how do you then determine them. But I think that more efforts of that type, which kind of require cross-jurisdictional cooperation aimed at a goal, are going to be really important, not just for reducing friction, but improving confidence and trust, and that's helpful for investment. So I just raise that as a model that is being used in this context, but ideally is something, a type of mechanism to look at for use with other issues.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to... Yes.
To that. The call for new best practice for us and issues which can be mapped to solutions is still open. So if you could go online onto the IGF website and suggest that we need to address this issue and maybe be one of the lead experts to look at mapping the idea and pulling more people together, it would be a wonderful addition to the IGF. Thank you for your question.
Okay, I'd like to take in this order, please, the person right in front of me here, sorry. If we could give her the microphone, and then there's some others.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Rekha Jain, and I'm from the Telecom Center of Excellence in India. Just 2 comments. One, when we talk of the trust issue, especially the awareness, we are doing some work with rural people and mobile payments, especially government pensions, etc., through mobile payments. And one of the things that emerged was that they are being given receipts, paper-based receipts through a small printer, but that ink dries up because it's the thermal printer. And then these are very poor people, and they're concerned that they have no record of whether they got something, how do they seek redressal. So that's one area where maybe we need to find out how to develop that trust in them, that there is some accounting being done somewhere and they can access it somehow. The second is about the initiative in India from the National Payment Corporation of India, which developed standards for payments, and that refers, which needs to be further worked on, looking into the aspect of trust and awareness in developing countries. That was just information, and how can some of these things, actual things being done on the ground, can be taken up for scaling up. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe the gentleman here, then we'll go to the table. We have two people who want to speak there, but first the gentleman and then the back there, please. Did you ask to speak?
After me.
Yes, please.
My name is Yavuz Selim. First of all, you are welcome to our country. I am from the host country. After several bankrupt of offline enterprise, I have late decided to go online. And now we are working on a project. My question is, it is mentioned that going online, making twice, at least twice business potential. But unfortunately, we are seeing that big companies even are working online with a very small team. Also, they are trying to pay very little tax. So what is your advice for online enterprises also using big workers for increasing the employment and prevent the unemployment? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rohan, may I ask you to address that, please?
Businesses are there to make money. They are not there to increase employment. It would be, I'm not a businessman. I have always been either in government or in the academy or right now I run a research organization. But even in my organization, if I were to create employment, I would be in trouble. So you employ the number of people that you need. So in one of the examples that I gave, we have e-commerce, which has a significant number of employees because you have a model that actually results in people having deliveries to their homes, which is not found in the United States or in conventional e-commerce models. So in that case, you are actually creating a significant amount of employment. In other cases, we are picking up the back office operations of various kinds of enterprises, maybe in Europe, maybe in Japan, maybe in the United States, and we are doing it in our countries because we have a comparative advantage in doing that. We are therefore creating employment. In my country, in Sri Lanka, we now have over 70,000 people employed in business process outsourcing and software exports, where we had none. Pretty much 10, 12 years ago. So the employment picture, I think, is something that we cannot give you advice on as a business how you should create employment. You should run a good business. From what I know, any businessman that I know several young entrepreneurs, they do hire. They have to keep hiring because of when their business is growing. But that is not for the purpose of creating employment.
Thank you very much. Now back to that table, please. We had two people who wanted to speak.
Hi, my name is Mishi Chaudhary. I'm a technology lawyer. I practice in New York and New Delhi. Thanks for the shout out from the panel, from Ms. Chaturvedi. My question to the panel is that you guys are all here, and it's in two parts. I believe that the panel suggested that IGF is great, and so is multi-stakeholderism. Or at least I'm hearing that, maybe I'm incorrect, but if it is all that, I'm a little perturbed and perplexed by these various calls for all of us to come together and decide about how these trust issues are addressed, as well as the various other legal problems which the governments are presenting. But at the same time, the civil society does not get much of a voice when a lot of important issues are being taken up in negotiating treaties like the TVP, which is going on, which the gentleman had actually highlighted some of the clauses as well. It is probably the first time an agreement is being taken up which introduces a direct obligation on cross-border data flow. And I believe that most of the negotiations are secret. None of the people know anything about it. And it's not just this, but extension of the copyright term from 50 to life of the author plus 50 to 70 is being talked about, and various other things are going on. So when everyone is kept out and there is all this talk about trust, we find it very difficult to understand which direction the government and the business is trying to take us, and how and where is our role, because all of these things are going to impact innovation as well as the small and medium enterprise businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, would you address that, please?
We're on? Yep. Yes, I agree with you. Here at the IGF, you get ICANN talking about accountability and transparency, and people say, oh, there's these issues. If you've got a spectrum, you've got ICANN, accountability and transparency at this end, good practice, multi-stakeholderism, TPP, TTIP, way down the other end, GATT, WTO, somewhere close to that end. So, yes, one of the things we need to recognise is that these processes, particularly the World Trade Organization and international trade negotiations, they've been going for a long time. They have a particular model which the stakeholders who've engaged with have benefited from. And new stakeholders coming in are always at a relative disadvantage. So you don't necessarily control the process, but if you don't participate, then yes, you're in big trouble. So a couple of things you can do. One is the World Trade Organization has a public forum once a year where civil society can talk to the World Trade Organization once a year. And it's coming up 1st of October to the 3rd of October. So next month, go to Geneva, and you've got 3 days there. ICANN's got a session on the 1st on the internet ecosystem development, and the next day the US law firm White & Case is hosting a session on data management and consumer protection in a globalised economy, opportunity or threat. So we're at least on the agenda, and some internet stakeholders are engaging. But again, the effectiveness of that is minimal. So awareness is the first thing for stakeholders in civil society. If you're feeling excluded, then yes, you are. But learn what you can do at baby steps, and then talk to your governments. Lobby them hard, because they're the ones who've got a more powerful role. At the moment, business has got their ear, and civil society is being ignored. It's only sustained pressure and coordinated sustained pressure. Use the internet, collaborate across countries to build coalitions which are influencing their governments, would be my suggestion. And keep going at it. It's a long process. You will not achieve results overnight.
Thank you very much, John. The other person, please. Yes.
Following up on the trade agreements, first of all, my name is Burcu Kılıç, and I work for Public Citizen, and my organization has been following the trade negotiations very closely. I think I have been to almost 15 TPP rounds as a civil society, as a stakeholder, and the doors are closed for us. But we have I'm originally from Turkey, and we have a saying in Turkish: if you can't get through the door, you should try the window. And that's what we are trying to do as a civil society. And I mainly deal with IP. I just started to work on e-commerce issues because there is no civil society dealing with e-commerce issues. And free flow of information is something the businesses are really enthusiastic about. So that makes us wonder what's in that chapter. Unfortunately, e-commerce chapter hasn't been leaked, so we don't know what is in the chapter as civil society or the public. But we know that the internet companies are really happy with that chapter and the USTR, because USTR is pushing for free flow of information. As a consumer rights organization, we are really, really concerned. And the TPP will introduce the first direct obligation on free flow of information. And there are exceptions, but there will be those exceptions, most probably be the trade exceptions under GATT and other WTO agreements. So we are not sure whether privacy or data localization will qualify as a trade exception. But that's an issue that no one discusses. We hear from the businesses, free flow of information is great. It's great for trade. It's great for businesses. But how about the consumers? So that's a problem for us, for the civil society. And I have to say, we are a bit disappointed that there is no one representing the consumers there on that panel, because ICT and trade, it's also about business, it's about businesses, but it's also about the consumers. And the doors are closed to us. Thank you.
Good. All right, thank you very much. And I think we have a point in the far back here. The gentleman back there. And then we'll take one more point or comment, and then we should conclude. Go ahead, please.
Nils Hedberg Grimlund, Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs Trade Policy Department. So if you wish to discuss TTIP, I'm all yours. And we are actually very interested in hearing opinions and suggestions, and are constantly looking for better solutions to various problems. And we do believe that free data flows are very, very important, but we are also quite interested in finding the best solutions for also ensuring a good privacy protection, for example, and data security. And that is actually also my question from especially Mr. Loeb, who has mentioned this a few times. Do you have any interesting suggestions or ideas for me to bring home when we sit in our TTIP den?
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, conceptually, certainly. First of all, I'd just like to say I find it unfortunate when the instinct is that if business is for something, that civil society should be against it or suspicious of it inherently. It's too simplistic. Businesses have customers and exist and continue to have business over the long term if they're serving their customers. And I always appreciate having the drive. Subi and I have talked about this a lot. I like people pushing us to be better. That's good. But I urge that the conversation not be viewed as the zero-sum approach. If one is for, the other should suspiciously be against. So, let's work together on things. On the cross-border data flow issue, on one hand, there is always a recognition that there will be a very narrow field of legitimate interests that might be raised where a limitation on flow of information is required. And it's narrowly constrained. It could be for a security reason or the like. The concern that business has is that at times industrial policy could drive a broader restriction than is necessary to reach a legitimate goal. And it could be to disrupt the scale of operations, to impose additional costs, to drive parties to do things more on a localized basis than there may be an economic or technological reason. And the point in an agreement is to get across the notion that there should not be any more restriction on the flow of information than absolutely necessary to meet those narrow, legitimate reasons. It's not to say there can never be a barrier, because that wouldn't even be true in the current instance. But what we don't want to see, and I say this from the standpoint of a company that serves customers that operate around the world, they operate around the world and they invest in other countries and they employ in other countries and they serve customers in other countries, but they do it in an integrated manner where not everything is hermetically sealed within that place. They are connected to other parts of their business or supply chains in other locations and need to have some flexibility in the models that they've built to be able to move information around rationally. So that's really the emphasis of why we raise it. And we raise it in this instance because we have seen a rising incipient risk of more than just narrowly constrained reasons, but sometimes industrial policy reasons to impose those limitations, and that is of a concern.
Subi?
Thank you, Dick. Just two quick responses. We've had some success as far as SOPA and PIPA are concerned. The process and what is it that is trying to be achieved is equally important for us. So when decisions are taken behind closed doors, there is dissent, there is pushback, and governments need to recognize, along with private sector, that this is something that is not acceptable. This has far-reaching consequences. So if you're looking at ACTA, if you're looking at policies which are looking at counterfeiting but will disallow somebody to share recipes if they haven't paid for them, that is something which is absolutely unacceptable. But as civil society, and when we look at multi-stakeholder platforms of participation, it is not perfect. It is far from it. People from the business communities or from governments will always have more resources to be present at places in Geneva or an equally expensive platform for discussion. But it is our responsibility to continue to engage. And I appreciate the woman from Turkey who pointed out when doors are shut on us, we have to look for these windows. And it is this genuine desire for consensus, for collaboration, which is what gets us the results. Of course, there are failures, but we're looking at constantly engaging with the platform to get somewhere. I would be very welcoming and happy to listen to alternatives to this platform. Thank you.
Okay, I think John wishes to say something, please.
Yep. One of the things I would encourage is the WTO, TTP, TPIP, etc., to come and propose workshops here at the IGF. Engage with internet governance stakeholders as well. Don't just sit back in Geneva and one day a year think that the world must come to you. That would be a big issue. The OECD is coming here and is engaging with platforms and workshops in a really good way. I haven't really come across much from the WTO. That's one thing. Secondly, the schedules for the GATS and for these trade agreements, what we've seen of some of them anyway that have been leaked, particularly with the GATS, the development of what is the internet, what is internet commerce, the definitions of what elements of trade will be opened up within particular countries in those schedules is really out of date. So speeding up that process and perhaps coming to this sort of forum where those organisations can learn a lot more about what's going on to better define elements of trade over the internet, I think that would be really helpful as well.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I see one more person wishes to speak.
No, just to comment that there was a proposal on a TPP specifically panel that we were hoping to get some of also the companies like eBay and Mozilla and other companies, and it was not inserted in the session and was not asked to be merged with this. But just to say that we actually we did try to have that and have some government officials on that. But I agree that I think it's the responsibility of all of us here to really raise awareness on how the binding decisions in trade agreements do affect internet governance, and actually they affect more our lives than many of the things that come out of IGF. So I am thankful that you guys had this panel, and I hope we collaborated in the future to raise this awareness here. Thank you. And I invite you to Brazil next year for IGF. I'm from Brazil, so it's going to be in João Pessoa, the Brazilian Caribbean. So.
Thank you very much, and I am certain it will not take too much encouragement for us to be in Brazil next year. Thank you. Let me conclude. We have hit this subject from many directions. It's a complex subject. And obviously, we're going to continue this discussion, I'm certain, at future IGFs. But we've looked at it from the point of view of innovation. We've looked at it from the point of view of economic growth and development. We've looked at it from the point of view of governance policies and the role of the private sector. But interestingly enough, we concluded on the subject of trust, and that trust must run through all of these aspects of the new relationship between globalization and the internet. I would also encourage in future IGFs, as we have our colleague from the OECD, Sam Paltridge, there are many institutions like Learn Asia, OECD, who look at these issues of new trade models given the new technology. And of course, we could expect the OECD and Learn Asia to look at these subjects and to bring the results of their considerations to places like the IGF. But with that, I would conclude and thank you all very much, and also please give an appreciation to the panelists.